Hello and welcome to the Feeling Good podcast. I am your host, Fabrice, and joining me here in the Marilyns studios is Dr. David Burns. Hi, David.
Hi, Fabrice.
Dr. David Burns has been a pioneer in the development of cognitive therapy, and he is the creator of the new team therapy. He is the author of Feeling Good, which has sold over 5 million copies in the United States and has been translated into over 20 languages. He is an emeritus adjunct clinical professor of psychiatry at the Stanford University School of Medicine. Welcome to episode 52 of the Feeling Good podcast, and I'm here with David on a Skype session today. We would like to first give a little bit of an apology to our listeners. It's been Labor Day and summer, and we've been off for a couple of weeks. So we're now restarting, and I'm sure a lot of you guys have had your own summer fun. If you managed to stay cool, because it's been quite hot down here. I wanted to mention, David, that we've had a lot of comments on Marilyns' podcast, the live session we did the past 3 podcasts. People are probably going to be happy to hear that we are doing a follow-up with Marilyn in a few weeks. It's been recorded already, but she came back about 8 weeks after the original session, and she had a relapse that was triggered by pain coming up from she had a metastasis on her rib, and so she kind of really got down and had some mood issues, and so she came back for a follow-up, and that too was a very mind-blowing experience, so something to look forward to. Is it okay if I read an email that was sent to us by one of the listeners that really expressed how she felt about listening to Marilyn?
Yes, and I would preface it by saying we had tremendous numbers of very moving emails. We just grabbed this one at random, but a lot of people were really touched by Marilyn and sent us beautiful follow-up comments that were very moving. This is just one of many.
Yeah, she really made an impact on people. It was really heartwarming to see that. So here's what Jennifer says. She thanks you, David, and Matt, and Marilyn, and she even thanks me, even though I was not doing much in the background there. She writes, "The podcast with Marilyn was powerful. I just finished the second part and had to write. I live in New Orleans, and so I'm unable to attend all the wonderful Tuesday nights we hear about. So to have this podcast is pretty significant and wonderful. I immediately felt connected to Marilyn during the first episode, feeling her emotions right along with her, like I was able to experience what it may be like to have this diagnosis, and felt sad when it was over and could hardly wait to hear the next week. So I had to be with that discomfort. Among other profound ways she helped through sharing her experience, she's teaching us the great lesson of impermanence as the Buddha taught. Such a valuable teaching she gives by sharing her experience. And this week was amazing. I was trying to pay close attention to the brilliant work of you and Matt. He's just so good." And she's right about that. I agree with her. "It was such a great learning experience. I felt like I was realizing and discovering right along with Marilyn. My heart is filled with love and pure compassion and deep appreciation for the 3 of you for sharing this with us. I want each of you to know what a tremendously beneficial learning experience this was for listeners, and that I will undoubtedly use this in my work, mainly with folks from LGBTQ, POC, and other marginalized communities, often dealing with addiction. I am hopeful it will directly impact my ability and skills in helping others. Ripples, ripples. I've been training in teams since 2013, but I am a slow learner and have mastered nothing about it yet. However, the timing of this podcast was perfect so that I have learned enough that I was with y'all every step of the way, listening, experiencing, and perhaps absorbing it in a new way. It brought some clarity to the process and flow. Pardon my rambling praise, but I am filled with gratitude and awe, looking forward to the next one. If you can pass on my thanks to Marilyn, Matt, and Fabrice, thank you. Jennifer. So very heartwarming, and she's not the only one who reported being touched by that live recording. So David, this session and others really brought up some questions from listeners, and one of the questions that came up was about when people fill out their brief mood survey or they list their emotions after doing the work, and people are really wondering, well, are they faking their scores? Are they just trying to please you, David, or the therapist in general? What would you say to people who have those questions?
Well, a couple of things. First, I'm very sympathetic to that kind of concern, and I think that critical thinking is crucial in our field. It's beginning to look to me, and we have a research study that will get underway shortly at the Feeling Good Institute, but it looks to me that with team we've created a genuine breakthrough in psychotherapy, and I've been experiencing really dramatic changes in people very, very quickly at speeds I would have thought impossible 5 or 10 years ago. And whenever I sit down with somebody or work with someone on a hike, almost every time they have, just like Marilyn, this pretty close to a complete elimination of symptoms, and they're really going from states of depression to states of elation and joy. And it's natural to think, is this real? And a lot of people say, well, maybe the patients are just faking their scores to
Right.
please you because they want to be nice to you. And actually,
and you're Dr. David Burns, and so there's all that authority aspect.
Yeah, absolutely. Many powerful forces are taking place, but in point of fact, people, the honesty on the scales is a big issue, but it's in the opposite direction from what you might think. The problem isn't that the patients won't be honest, but that the patients are honest, and many therapists can't take the heat. When, for example, patients rate therapists on therapeutic empathy and therapeutic helpfulness at the end of the session, and of course Marilyn gave us perfect scores on those scales, but those scales are so sensitive that we've done experiments with therapists in clinical practice as well as therapists, so-called experts at high-powered teaching institutions, and when they give out my brief mood survey to patients initially, they report that they get failing grades pretty much from 100% of their patients at every session on every scale. And so you can hardly argue that the patients aren't being honest on the scales, because the feedback therapists get is pretty threatening to the therapist. And if the therapist has the courage to be open with the patient and to discuss that feedback, you can use that information to transform your practice. And I think that's one of the reasons that my own skills have improved and developed over the years, because I've done that with every patient at every single session, and it's hard because I make many therapeutic mistakes, and my patients will slam me for those mistakes. But what I found is that if I'm really open with my patients and treat them with respect and see the truth in their criticisms, it usually leads to a deepening of the therapeutic relationship. We had a scientist who visited the Tuesday group at Stanford a few months ago. He came from Syracuse, New York, Professor Mark Noble, who's a molecular biologist and geneticist and one of the pioneers in the development of stem cell research. And he had some new information on antidepressants, which I won't reveal right now, but he will be publishing two papers soon. They're in the works. But he is keenly interested in drug-free treatments for depression. That's why he came out, and he hiked with us on Sunday for 3.5 hours. He's just a wonderful, down-to-earth fellow. And he saw, we showed him demonstrations both on the hike as well as a video at the Tuesday night of people who had severe problems, who had a sudden total elimination of symptoms the very, very first session. And I also told him how it's hard for therapists to believe that this can happen, because therapists have been trained to think that depression comes from, childhood experiences and a long history of trauma and feeling like you're not good enough. It builds up like a mountain over years and years, and that the treatment has to take years and years and is very slow. And then when I show that people can recover suddenly and instantly, it just seems too much to believe, too hard to take. It just seems like a fraud. But what Dr. Noble suggested is that it's really the way the brain works. If you think about brain function, for example, pain, if you touch a hot stove with your hand, you'll pull your hand back.
Sure.
To get away from that pain, and the moment you do that, the pain quickly subsides. And that's about the speed that we see depression disappearing in a therapy session. And he said it's like these distorted thoughts that patients have, like, I'm not good enough, or like in Marilyn's case, my faith should be stronger. I shouldn't doubt the existence of God. I shouldn't doubt the existence of the afterlife. That the moment you stop believing those thoughts, the pain disappears. It's like pulling your hand off the hot stove, and it should not surprise anyone that depression can be eliminated quickly, with amazing speed if you have effective techniques. We saw this also at the intensive I did in Burlingame, as well as up in Canada. The two intensives this summer of 2017. And at both locations, we had volunteers who had significant, prolonged depression. The one in Philadelphia was a lovely young woman who said she hadn't had one happy moment in her entire life. And I sat down with her and Jill Levitt, my co-therapist, and she had very scathing self-critical thoughts, and she'd had a history of pretty horrific traumas, and she had horrible thoughts like I'm an idiot, and I'm fat and ugly, and just the meanest kind of negative thoughts. But we went through the team model, empathized with her. We did the paradoxical agenda setting, and when we came to the methods, she just blew her negative thoughts out of the water. It was I'd say almost the most amazing live demonstration I've ever been involved in. She recovered so quickly. It was like a Jack in the Box. How you pop, how a Jack in the Box, someone suddenly pops out of a box.
Yeah,
toy.
right.
And it was like that. This self-loving, powerful self just suddenly popped out of the box. The whole thing only took about an hour and 10 minutes. We tried to delay it as much as possible. I think we could have finished with her in about 25 minutes, completed the entire course of therapy. But again, in the evening, most of the people were just blown out of the water. It's just like, it was a jaw-dropping demonstration of what's possible using these new team CBT techniques. But there were 2 or 3 people out of the audience of 125 who were actually enraged by the live demonstration, because they were convinced it was a fraud, that I had hired some actress to come in. And fortunately, by the end of the workshop, and we did the last demonstration with that same young woman, relapse prevention training, and hit her with all of her negative thoughts again, and she was just still a powerhouse, and people suddenly saw that it really had been real, and then that led to a standing ovation, which when that happens. It's so gratifying to me. But it is hard for people to believe that such power can now be available in the hands of psychotherapists. But as this woman pointed out who wrote the letter, it's hard to learn team. I make it look very easy when I teach it, but it really takes tremendous time and commitment to learn to be able to do this.
And I want to confirm that, because I do use team in my practice, and it's a constant trying to get all the components working together, and especially really stick to the agenda setting. It's so tempting often to skip over that part, or at least to give it lip service, and without that, it just doesn't hold together.
Absolutely, yeah, well said. One other question that has come up since we've been doing live demos, and I want to say we're going to be doing more live demos on the podcast, and we have some partially completed and just need some editing. They're actually, we've got one that's ready to go, but it needs a little editing. But another question has people saying, well, does this last? If you're getting this kind of miraculous change,
exactly, yes.
Will these effects last?
And by the way, this has been a criticism of CBT in general from therapists who have been trained in other approaches, saying, well, yes, CBT, yes, it works temporarily, but it's just a quick fix and it doesn't address the deeper issues. So
yeah. By the way, that's another topic we could talk about.
Yeah, that would be a good one to do a complete podcast on. Yeah,
claim to be knowing what these deeper issues are and claim to be working with deeper issues, and is that valid, or is that just a justification for your own therapeutic ineffectiveness? There's two ways to look at these things, but at any rate, the thing is that as human beings, we're not going to overcome our humanity, our humanness, and part of humanness is that we all get pretty upset sometimes, and certain things threaten us, and we get into these distorted thoughts. In fact, it happened to me just 2 days ago. I kind of stay out of the line of fire at Stanford. I'm on the voluntary faculty. I don't get paid for my teaching, but I do love teaching. So I put in hundreds of hours every year teaching and helping out in different ways. But I stay out of the line of fire because my thinking is very, very different from many other people in the department. As you know, Fabrice, I'm not a strong believer anymore that antidepressants are necessarily the best treatment for depression. They could be helpful to some people, but I think we've been oversold, and so I don't like to promote that. And then we're developing this radical new approach to psychotherapy, which may seem threatening to some people too. So I go in and I teach my groups, and we have fantastic groups. I just love teaching. I love my students and my colleagues, and see some magical experiences happening regularly when we do the live work. But I try to stay out of line of fire. At any rate, I got an email from the department chairman, who I have barely spoken to in 10 years, and said, "Oh, I need to contact you. Is this your email?" And so I immediately got back, said, "Oh yes, here's my phone number too if you need to call." And then I had about 3 agonizing hours saying, have they finally found out, what a loser I am, and are they trying to get rid of me now? And it was really, my heart was gripped by terror. And then finally she called and said that she had just been named the head of the American Psychiatric Association Publishing Group or something like that. And did I have any books that I could write for them on psychotherapy? I couldn't believe it.
Wow.
And so I said, well, I've got this ebook that I've been selling as a PDF to therapists called Tools, Not Schools of Therapy. And I had an offer to publish it years ago, one of the major publishers, but they wanted me to indemnify them, which I refused to do. So I turned down their offer and just self-published it. But it would be an honor to have it published by the American Psychiatric Association. I said it needs some editing now. But she got excited, and I sent it to her. We'll see if anything comes of it. But again, it's how we have these negative thoughts that the basic schema, I'm not good enough, and my own is pretty soon the authorities are going to find out, and smash me. And these systems will come up from time to time during moments of vulnerability. So you have to be willing to do your work on an ongoing basis. But the neat thing is that the technique that worked for you initially will always work for you. And whether it's the daily mood log or writing down your thoughts or identifying the distortions or the hidden emotion model or the experimental technique or whatever the technique is. But and I've said this before, but as far as negative thoughts coming back, they will come back. But I think the Dalai Lama said the purpose of life is happiness, and that's a very simple truth there. And I think we're all entitled to a lot of happiness, and I think people are entitled to expect to be happy most of the time, but not all of the time. And when those buzzing, negative, distorted thoughts come back, say you're not good enough, you suck, you're hopeless, you're a loser, you shouldn't have screwed up, whatever your theme is, you've got to sit down, write down those thoughts, identify the distortions, and challenge them just in the same way that you did when you initially recovered. And I think most teachers have emphasized the importance of ongoing practice. If you're a tennis player, you've got to get out and practice and take lessons and improve all the time. And if you don't get out on the court and practice, your tennis game won't improve. And those who teach meditation say you've got to meditate every day. Now, I'm not a meditator. It's not my thing. But those who are into it, they set aside maybe 20 minutes in the morning or 20 minutes in the evening to do their daily meditation. Many religious groups say you have to do your prayer every day. There is some process of maintaining your emotional health. And we have the same in Team CBT, specific methods that will work for you that you have to use on an ongoing basis whenever you're upset.
So that makes me curious. What method did you use while you were waiting 3 agonizing hours for that woman to contact you?
Well, I used several things. The first thing was kind of like examine the evidence type of thing. Is there some reason to believe that she's going to be criticizing me for something? How have my feedback been in my Stanford teaching? And well, the feedback is like extraordinarily positive. How are my relationships with colleagues? I did some teaching in the Department of Medicine recently, and then they invited me back to give a big presentation at Stanford in October for the general public. They were going to be inviting the hospital people and people from Google, and they were all excited about having me do the first really large-scale teaching at Stanford. So the evidence indicates that this isn't correct. So that was one thing, and another was reattribution. What are some other methods? Reason she might be contacting me? Well, maybe they need our conference room because sometimes they have faculty meetings, and so they move us to another room. And then my ultimate one is the acceptance paradox, that I'm pretty flawed as a human being, and I'm lucky to have gone as far as I've gone, given all of my defects and shortcomings. And if they didn't want me anymore at Stanford, then maybe I can live with that and try to learn from the experience and use it as an opportunity to grow. But fortunately, it seems like I'm getting maybe a little bit of extra credibility at Stanford, and boy, that would be wonderful. And we have a new group that we're starting for the psychiatric residents, and there's been a strong, enthusiastic initial response from them. But
So that's really good examples of how you could really work yourself out of that mood state. And in fact, to kind of circle back to what we were saying about talking about earlier in the podcast is as I was saying, Marilyn went through a relapse, and that was triggered by an external event. But of course, as we know, it's not the external events that create our moods, but how we interpret them and what we tell ourselves. And what would you say? I mean, I know we'll talk more about this when we do publish that session, but couldn't she have used the same methods that were used during the previous 3 episodes to really work herself out of it?
I think that everyone has the ability to do that, and she says that when she does her own work with her negative thoughts, it is in fact helpful to her. But if you wanted more information about that, I guess Marilyn would be the one to ask. I think that one of the odd things about human nature is that we sometimes don't want to pick up the tools and use them. We sometimes want to kind of cling to our depression and to anxiety and to relationship conflicts and to stick with habits and addictions. And I think that's why the paradoxical agenda setting is such an important part of team therapy, that new insights about why people do get stuck in negative moods and what they can do to get unstuck. And that's actually going to be a major focus of the new book that I'm working on almost pretty much a daily basis now. And so I'm kind of excited about that. It will have all of the new innovations since I wrote Feeling Good. I was originally going to revise it for the publishers. They both the publishers of Feeling Good and the Feeling Good Handbook have been really begging for a revision, but the books were just too tightly written, and they work very well the way they are now to try to take them apart and put them back together again. And I decided instead to take all of the fantastic new insights and methods and vignettes and stories and put them in a new book. So
I'm very excited to see that book whenever you're done with it, because that's a question I get a lot from my clients. They often say, well, it's good to do the agenda setting with you, Dr. Nye, but, when it's just me, I don't really know how to do this. And that's what I would like to be able to help them with and give them a little bit of a manual, some guidelines on how to do this on their own. I don't want them to depend on me.
Yeah, that's right, and that's one of the features of the new book for sure, is how to do the paradoxical agenda setting and to discover what it shows you about you that's beautiful and awesome. We did it again in group. We did live therapy in the Tuesday night group again, and the paradoxical agenda setting is a woman who's 70, and the group that she was working for as a therapist went out of business, some Catholic charities, and she was very anxious for her sons. One lives in Europe and one lives in the Midwest, and they're worrying about her, and she doesn't have a lot of money, and she was raised in a foreign country and speaks with a pretty heavy accent, and she was just in a state of depression and worry, and will I be able to find a new job, and I'm becoming a burden to my sons, and then we did the paradoxical agenda setting, and she just went from a state of depression and anxiety to joy. It was it's just like watching a miracle unfold. And now I can't remember, what was your question? I'm rambling like.
What was my question? I don't even remember. I think I was talking about why people. Relapse and don't want to use the tools, and we were going into agenda setting and how can people do agenda setting with themselves as opposed to working with a therapist.
Yeah, and then part of my problem with the new book, there's so many things that I'm writing about that I'm excited about. I don't know, which ones will be good and which ones won't be good, but I've got a whole lot on how to see what your negative thinking and feeling show about you that's beautiful and awesome. It's just mind-blowing to see that. And then I'm also very heavily into this thing of, it seems to me that most depression and anxiety results from the idea that I have a self that isn't good enough. A self that's going to be judged. Like for some people, it might be I'm a bad father. Someone on a hike had that thought recently because he had snapped at his sons. He was angry with his sons, and then he got kind of irritable with them, and then he was tearful on the hike, thinking this proved he was a bad father. But you see there, he's generalizing from a conflict with his sons to his self, his entire self. Do you see that? Yeah. And so this idea that we have a self that can be judged or found to be bad or not good enough. I'm writing a whole lot about that topic. Like, is it possible to have a self that's defective or inferior or worthless or not worthwhile? And then a second related issue is, do we even have a self or need a self? And I'm finding those topics also very, very exciting.
I do too. I think you can have a hard time convincing certain people that they don't have a self.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, yeah. I'm worried about that too. And do people even want to see this? Because then if you realize that you don't have a self, that's what the Buddhists call the Great Death, or at least that's one version of enlightenment, and it's very, very freeing. But then at the same time, it means you don't have an identity, and it might also mean you don't have a soul. And now we're getting into areas that are going to be very, very controversial from the point of view of people's religious beliefs.
Yeah. Well, it's good to be back on the air, David. I'm definitely looking forward to this book. And we still have to decide what our upcoming episodes will be about. I've been trying to convince you to do things on relationship, but that seems to be fraught with either too much complexity or... But I think we'll come up with something interesting for people.
Oh, yeah. And I might say that for all of you who are wondering what caused Fabrice's disappearance, it was he has a wonderful new lady love and was camping for the last 2 weeks.
Enough.
A much-needed break. And by the way, I didn't tell you, but I got so many podcasts from people saying, boy, Fabrice deserves a break, and he's doing great work, and a lot of praise for you that I've been getting in emails almost on a daily basis.
I don't believe you.
It's true.
Okay, well, thank you, David. That was a nice episode. And we'll see you and our listeners again next week.
Thank you, Fabrice.
Thank you, David. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
This has been another episode of the Feeling Good podcast. For more information, visit Dr. Burns' website at feelinggood.com, where you will find the show notes for this podcast under the blog page, and where you can leave your comments and questions. The website has an abundance of resources for therapists as well as non-therapists, including books, workshops, a list of online training groups around the world, and much more. Theme music is Gypsy Jazz in Paris, 1935, composed and performed by Brett Van Donsel. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and I invite you to join us next time for another episode of the Feeling Good podcast.